Hello and welcome to our industry Q&A, which focuses on sexual harassment in the workplace. My name is James Callender. I'm the Director of Business Solutions Australia New Zealand for Workplace Options. I have over 12 years experience in the wellbeing industry, working with organisations of all shapes and sizes from Fortune 500 and ASX 200 through to mum and dad small business. I am passionate about changing the mental health narrative of Australia one story at a time. Before I introduce today's guest, Renee, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I am recording this session, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to acknowledge their people, past, present, and emerging. Today, I am joined by Renee Kasbarian, partner at Henry William Lawyers. Renee is an employment and work health and safety lawyer who works with clients throughout the employment life cycle, advising and assisting on a range of general employment, work, health, safety, and industrial relations matters. Renee also collaborates with clients on proactive employment and WHS projects. When it comes to assisting clients, Renee supports the HR functions of the business and adopts a commercial approach to achieve viable and positive outcomes for clients. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's move in because this is quite a topic of interest at the moment. So, Renee, could you help provide insight into the recent amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act concerning workplace sexual harassment and shed some light on the concept of positive duty, which is referenced in the Act?
Yes. So you may recall, James, going back a couple of years now, or a few years, 2020, we had the Respect at Work report released, which was an inquiry was undertaken in relation to sexual harassment and sex discrimination in Australian workplaces. And what followed from that inquiry was the Respect at Work report. It made a number of recommendations, including some changes or legislative changes were recommended. So it was following that process that we saw then the Sex Discrimination Act become amended. And there were a number of changes that were made in there. Some of those amendments included introducing or defining some new concepts around sexual harassment and sex discrimination, including the notion of sex-based harassment, which relates to harassment in connection with work that is based on your sex, and also conduct relating to or which creates a workplace environment that is hostile on the grounds of sex. So we saw that come into play. We also saw coverage expanded in terms of these types of conduct who this conduct applies to in the workplace or who's responsible for it. So whilst previously it was dealing with the traditional employer-employment relationship, that's now been expanded in terms of sexual harassment and sex-based discrimination in workplaces. It's been expanded now to adopt the work health and safety definitions of worker and person conducting a business or undertaking. So those definitions are a lot broader than your traditional employee-employer definitions. Workers includes your contractors, volunteers, if you've got interns or work experience students, labour hire, anyone essentially who's working or conducting work activities in the business or undertaking. PCBU is again broader, so it's not just an employer, but any person who is conducting a business or undertaking. So that will cover things like associations, whether you're incorporated, unincorporated, partnership models, even sole traders. So it's anyone in that type of space. We also saw Human Rights Commission now also has greater powers in terms of being able to enforce compliance and undertake enforcement activities with these changes. The big one then, as you mentioned, was the introduction of the positive duty. That was the most significant amendment and the one that has caught the most attention as well. So the introduction of the positive duty is, as the name suggests, a positive duty on duty holders, essentially. So a person conducting a business or undertaking, so employers, organisations, businesses, they now have a positive duty under the Act to eliminate, as far as possible, these unlawful types of conduct that we're talking about. So we're talking about sex discrimination in a work context, sexual harassment in the workplace, and these new concepts too. So this hostile work environment based on sex, and sex-based harassment as well. So there is this positive duty now that's been imposed. And it's a positive duty for the duty holder or the PCBU. They need to take reasonable and proportionate measures or reasonable proportionate steps to eliminate, so far as reasonably practicable, these types of behaviours occurring in the workplace or in a work context. So it's a big duty. It is an important one now, and where that sort of stems from, and what you might think is, you might say, well, there's always been a duty to try and prevent these behaviours from happening, like part of your work health and safety obligations, psychological risks and injuries, physical as well. It's always been there. But it came about because in the report or the inquiries undertaken, one of the big issues identified was, and I think this helps to understand the positive duty and how you might meet it. One of the big issues identified was that organisations or business seem to be more reactive to these behaviours, so that they'll take steps and they'll take measures when an issue occurs or when a complaint occurs. So there was more of a reactive approach as opposed to a proactive approach to try and stop these behaviours occurring in the first instance. And that's what the positive duty is aimed at. So it's aimed at preventing or stopping these behaviours occurring at all in the workplace, so that you're not getting to the complaint point, you're not getting to the reactive point, essentially.
It is really great to see that we are moving to a more proactive environment. So we had that from a physical safety perspective. We are seeing that from a psychological safety perspective, and it's great to see that from a sexual harassment perspective as well, that we as business leaders and as employees are approaching it with a prepared mind and really being proactive about it, as opposed to being reactive when something happens.
Mm.
So Renee, in the ever-evolving landscape of employment, can you elaborate on the role leaders and managers play in actively preventing and addressing sexual harassment? If there's anything that you can share in terms of how they can contribute to creating a workplace culture that prioritizes, and I'll reiterate that, prioritizes safety and respect.
Very good question, James, very good question. And I think what is important when it does come to meeting this positive duty and looking at preventing and addressing these behaviours in the workplace is that it does need to sort of come from the top down. So it is about creating a workplace culture where this behaviour is not accepted, it's not tolerated, and it doesn't form part of your culture. And as we know, workplace culture is set by the organisation. It's set by the business. And what does that mean? It's set by your business leaders. It's set from the top. So it is important that executives, senior leadership teams, they are making sure that they set the tone, essentially. How do you do that? It's a good question, and it's one I think everyone is still trying to figure out. I think most importantly, the first step is that leadership and your senior team, education and training. They need to understand what these behaviours are, what are the unlawful behaviours we're talking about, what is the positive duty, what is your duty there, and then you're looking at, as part of that education piece, okay, well, how do we as an organisation, for us, our particular organisation, how do we identify our potential risks, our potential factors that may be conducive to sexual harassment or sex discrimination, what in our business puts us at risk, and what is suitable for our business, or what does our business need to try and manage that risk or prevent those behaviours happening. It needs to be a tailored approach. It needs to suit your business because every business is different. And when you're talking about a workplace culture, you need to make sure that what you're doing suits your particular business. So education and training, that's the first piece of the puzzle, I think, for the leadership team. And they know best their workplace culture. So if you arm them with the information, they can then move into, okay, well, how do we make this part of our workplace? There's a few things that I think that you can do as a leader to make sure you are, preventing this behavior in the workplace. But again, it's going to be different in every organisation. So I would recommend having a tailored approach or a tailored program for your business. But some of the things you can look at doing is, if you're a senior leader, keep up to date with information or new education pieces that are coming out. So whether you're looking at the Human Rights Commission website, if you're making sure you're getting your legal updates, reaching out to your service providers for additional updates or training, make sure you're keeping up to date with new information coming through. That's your ongoing education piece. Also then, start to look at, just lead by example. It's a very simple one. Lead by example. Display the behaviours you want to see in the workplace. As we are aware, there are some leaders in workplaces that do not exhibit behaviours that you want to see happening when it comes to trying to prevent this conduct from occurring. So lead by example is another good one. I also think another one is senior leaders need to be communicating with their workforce. Communicate with their workforce about these behaviours. Be open and transparent about the fact the organisation doesn't tolerate it, that it is prohibited and it won't be accepted. So making sure that your employees are aware of that and you have informed them of that. That needs to be communicated by senior leaders. And making sure they're aware of that. And as part of that communication piece as well, I think, making sure your employees know or that they feel comfortable to raise these issues with management and with senior leaders. Too often, I think employees or workers, we'll use the term workers, don't feel comfortable approaching senior leaders or approaching management to say that there is an issue. As a leader in your business, change that story, change that narrative, be approachable and let your workers know you are approachable. They can come to you to report issues. And that's going to help you to stay on top of it as well. You'll know what's happening on the ground, essentially. You'll know when issues arise. You'll know when you need to take steps to meet your positive duty. So I think that's another important piece.
It is interesting, Renee, you and I have spoken at length about this over a variety of different topics now. Education comes up quite often. And I know myself as an employee of an organisation, there is education that I need to do on an annual basis, and sometimes compliance training can be a real drag. However, there is a lot of meaningful and valuable information that is distributed or that is included in compliance training for a very valid reason. And I think it's important that leaders of organizations and their respective learning and development teams consider how education can be consumed in a meaningful way by their employees and targeting or tailoring those examples to their organization. And so as opposed to 30 June being the deadline by which all of our compliance training needs to be completed by, how can it be more of a regular cadence throughout the year so that we are consuming this knowledge, we are taking on board those various approachable, appropriate and accessible reporting mechanisms as well, and that we're not just learning it in these short, intensive bursts that sometimes people can come to be dissatisfied with or really uncomfortable in having to do that compliance training all at once at a certain time of year. So that's where leading by example with leaders really sharing that narrative internally, potentially through a town hall style scenario. And then people go away and do the compliance training immediately after that leader briefing so that it is meaningful, it is impactful, and people are consuming the knowledge that they need to ultimately be improving the safety of our organizations and removing the risk of sexual harassment in the workplace.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think those are the things businesses need to start thinking about. What does your training program look like? What does your education program look like? You're right. It can't just be 30 June, drag you through compliance training. And again, it's a tick the box exercise, really. It can't be a tick the box exercise anymore. You need to be able to demonstrate that it is ongoing. People understand. And that means that sometimes what you need to think about, I think, is we do say educational training, you do think, okay, compliance training, my 1 hour induction and then my 1 hour annual or 2 hour annual every year. Think outside the box a bit. Part of meeting the positive duty is that you do need to, my recommendation in terms of trying to meet your positive duty is you need to, first of all, you do conduct a risk assessment, you identify your gaps, you go through that process, but then you need to develop your action plan or your prevention plan. You need to develop your strategies. What specific steps is your business going to take to prevent and respond to sexual harassment and sex discrimination? Your training program is one of it, but what does your organisation look like that you can make sure education is an ongoing piece? Toolbox talks, town halls, all good examples of board meetings where you can exactly make sure there's an education piece around that. And it doesn't need to always be, the 2 hour stretch of training or anything like that. It might just be a snippet. It might just be a snippet, a quick update on something, a quick reminder to your board perhaps, hey, Human Rights Commission has published these new guidelines. Here's a link to it. Go read it, please. Keeping yourself updated that way is a good one. With your employees, you might even do something in terms of ongoing education, workplace policy of the month, for example. If you do that, every couple of months or so, or every few months, it's the sexual harassment policy that you're reminding employees of. Go back and revisit your behaviours. Remember what this looks like and that it is prohibited. Things like that. You might even just have things around the workplace that are simple ongoing training mechanisms. I know at the moment one thing organisations can keep an eye out for is the Human Rights Commission has indicated they're going to release some posters or infographics that you can put up in the workplace, which are just, again, simple education pieces, which will help your business to be able to keep everyone informed and keep them educated, but also comes back to your culture as well, and helping to build a workplace culture where these behaviours aren't tolerated and they are prevented, because you're making it part of the everyday. You're making it part of your everyday processes.
And Renee, you mentioned there's some resources that are available for distribution within the workplace and amongst the workforce, and that's quite a nice transition into the next question that I have for you, which is considering the impact of technological advancements on work dynamics, especially with the rise of hybrid and remote working. How has the approach to addressing and preventing sexual harassment shifted? And what unique challenges do these changes pose for organizations? And how do they navigate these challenges as well, given that we're all not in the same place at the same time anymore, and a poster in the kitchen may not necessarily be the best solution if we are decentralized?
It is an interesting place that we now operate in. Gone are the days of, I think, the physical 9 to 5, very much so. We now do have a lot of remote working arrangements. We have a lot of technological advancements. The way we work has changed significantly, which does mean your processes, your systems that you have in place for managing work health and safety also need to change, and they need to be updated. They need to reflect the new ways in which we work. We now, as you say, James, there's remote working now, there's work from home. We do have technology that has advanced. Your work health and safety duties still apply. So that's the important thing to remember. Still applies. Your positive duty under the Sex Discrimination Act, that still applies. If it's related to work, it's still there. Okay, if it's still work activities, regardless of how or where someone's working. So it does pose its unique challenges. Businesses, organisations, they need to be very conscious of this. They do need to be aware of it, and they do need to take it into consideration when they're assessing their risks and what their reasonable and proportionate measures are going to look like. So first step for the organisation, when you're conducting your risk assessment so that you can identify where your risks or hazards lie when it comes to sex discrimination, sexual harassment, you need to take into account in that risk assessment, I have workforce that works remotely. Okay, so what do we identify there? What issues do we have? So actually take it in as a factor. Turn your mind to it. That's the first step. I think too often it's easy to be missed, or it's not specifically thought of. So I know it sounds quite obvious, but you'd be surprised at how often it's not taken into consideration. So that needs to be the first thing that you do. Then you will find once you do build it into your risk assessment, you'll start to identify what the issues are, what the challenges are, differences in technology, using different messaging platforms, for example. You know, we're using Teams now, we use Slack. What's your electronic communication look like for your remote workers? What are their work hours? You need to think about that, because sometimes we now move, one of the core challenges with this is that blurring of the lines between work and personal when you've got employees working remotely, when you've got them using chat platforms and using electronic communications. Think about all of these things, okay? They're very important. What you do then is you look at that and go, okay, well, what measures can we take? What can we do to try and balance this? It's going to be different for each organisation. Remember that. It will vary. It will need to be tailored. But a few things that I think they should be looking at in terms of trying to manage this particular way in which we work, do revisit what's your IT capabilities. What are you using to monitor your employee communications electronically and things like that? And I'm not saying, to be very draconian about it or things like that, but you do need to make sure you've got sufficient systems in place to be able to monitor communications, review the processes you have in, consult with your workers as well. Consult with your workers. What do they think they need in terms of support or assistance if they're working remotely? So have an open conversation with them. See if they can give you ideas about what they need to help support them. Another thing that I also think is security on any workplace devices as well. Make sure that's all up to scratch. Make sure your devices are secure so that you can keep track of what's happening with your employees, that they're not going to be susceptible to, potential like viruses or things like that. Or, what I think of when I think about security, I think of people just not being able to access information properly or being locked out of things. Making sure that all your devices are up and running, they're secure, they're safe. Make sure that's happening. And the other bit is making sure things are still accessible to these employees, making sure everything is accessible, whether you're doing that through an intranet, for example, whether you look at having EAP providers in place that are accessible via email, via a hotline, all of those types of things for your employees. That's making sure that support and assistance is available for them as well. So there's a few things there that organisations can be looking at to try and navigate through it. But I do think it's also one where, given the challenges involved with this new type of work, you need to reach out to people who can also help you to develop more specific plans to the workplace. So whether that's reaching out to your EAP providers or your service providers there or your legal team, it's reaching out to them as well to make sure that what you're doing is sufficient for remote work arrangements or for the technology that is used in your workplace as well.
Thank you. That's very informative. So, Renee, we've explored the changes to the Sex Discrimination Act, and we know that the people conducting businesses or undertakings has been, I guess, the new language that has come in to supersede the historic employer relationship when it comes to sexual harassment. We also know that there are more individuals that are involved in our organizations now than ever before. You mentioned subcontractors, you mentioned casual work staff, students, etc., and that the positive duty to be eliminating sexual harassment from the workplace applies to all that are involved in that workplace. You mentioned that culture is the key here and that we need to lead by example and set the tone from the top and then educate our organizations from the top down in terms of the importance of sexual harassment in the workplace. And what I mean by that is that people are aware of what it is and how to reduce and how to eliminate it in our workplaces so that our employees, when they come to work, feel safe, they are healthy, and they are able to perform well. And ultimately, we really want to be encouraging those who are listening to maintain open lines of communication within their organization for two reasons. The first is so that we can educate leaders on new changes that are happening within the industry. And second of all, so that employees feel that there is appropriate, accessible ways for them to report sexual harassment in the workplace as we all move towards our end goal of removing it. Renee, is there any final words of advice for our viewers here today?
Final piece of advice, James, I think is make sure that you don't ignore this. Don't ignore your positive duty. Don't ignore what's happening in your workplace. Treat it seriously. I know there is sometimes a tendency to not worry so much about these things or you know, to an extent, you think that you've got the workplace culture there, that it's good, that it's not happening in our organisation. We don't need to worry so much about this. And which is, you know, not doubting there is good workplace culture, but, you know, don't ignore it still. Complacency can sometimes be detrimental. That's where sometimes I think issues do arise, really. And people do get caught by surprise or they get caught off guard. It's quite unexpected. Don't ignore it. Stay on top of it. Do your risk assessments. Work on your workplace culture. Look at what measures you need to be taking because we're moving with the positive duty into enforcement now. So the Human Rights Commission now does have the powers to enforce compliance with the positive duty. So that's come into effect as of December last year. So this is also why I say my key piece of advice today is to not ignore this. You don't want to be the one the Human Rights Commission is investigating or inquiring with. They do have this power now. And the other part of that, and not to scare anyone, I don't want to do that, but the other reason why I say it's important not to ignore it and to make sure you are working on how to meet the positive duty is if you do fail to comply, there can be penalties for that. There can be repercussions of it. So it's not just looking at it in the Human Rights Commission or under the Sex Discrimination Act. I mean, the Human Rights Commission is going to have the power to issue compliance orders and things like that you do need to comply with if you were issued a notice. That can then be, if you're in breach of it, subject to a court proceeding if you don't comply with that notice. Bearing in mind as well, just even on a broader scale, sexual harassment or sex discrimination, it can have implications for your work health and safety obligations. If you're not taking the time to try and eliminate that risk or minimise it, you could be in breach of your work health and safety obligations. And that's where we're talking potential prosecutions. We're talking fines, things like that. the Fair Work Act as well now has a prohibition on sexual harassment. If that's breached, again, you're looking at fines. So it is being taken seriously. It has this. There is a big spotlight on the moment. We've had these legislative changes. There is this push for change and for these behaviours to be stamped out and to be prevented. It is a serious topic, and that's why I don't want to end on the scary note, but my advice very much is just to all organisations and businesses: don't ignore this. Take the steps now to make sure you're meeting that duty.
So in a lighter note, lean into your partnerships. If you do have a legal team, have a chat to them. And if you don't, reach out to Henry Williams, because they'll be able to help you out. But lean into the partnerships that you already have within your organization. If you have a wellbeing provider or an EAP provider, reach out to them for assistance and guidance. If not, we can help you out here at Workplace Options. If you've got a HR consulting firm, reach out to them. Reach out to Fair Work Australia as well. There are lots of resources to help you feel comfortable in this new phase of business and to take it out of the too hard basket, because to Renee's point, nobody would like to be the one that the regulator makes an example of. So please lean into those partnerships and make the very best use of them to help you run your business and to keep your individuals, your employees healthy and safe. Renee, thank you for joining us here today, and I look forward to catching up next time. We've had quite a series, you and I, together, and no doubt this won't be the last.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure to have a chat with you, and I definitely look forward to next time round. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you.